So, Dungeons and Dragons is in a lull. Um, I've played Dungeons and Dragons since 1987. Basically, the first year I moved to the area around Alliston, Ontario. Previously, I'd been in another city and like a smaller city nearby that my parents moved out to the country, and then we had no cable. Couldn't watch G.I. Joe anymore. It was very, very sad. Um, and I met, you know, my best friends, the ones that I still am close with, and we started playing Dungeons and Dragons, although it was janky because we didn't have all the books and we just kind of made it up as we went along, and we eventually became gods and then stopped. And then we didn't really play again until high school in grade 9. And we played with a teacher there. And then we also just started playing pretty much every weekend, especially in the summer. And we would play, during the weekdays in the summer as well. And it was great. We preferred second edition, and that teacher preferred first edition. And there were edition wars going on back then. And then, the 90s came, and TSR put out a lot of books. And I thought that was pretty great because they started really innovating, because the person that ran TSR, Lorraine Williams, probably she didn't understand, didn't care about gamers. In fact, looked down her nose at gamers, but certainly liked making the money. So therefore, pretty much approved anything they made so that it would make books, that it would make money. And eventually TSR died to removal. It kind of, overextended itself, more than kind of, and it acquired a lot of debt and collapsed and was bought by Wizards of the Coast. And then Wizards of the Coast came out with third edition, and that kind of revitalized the game, especially with 3.5, and for a long time it chugged along in third edition until they decided to update it again at fourth edition. And they were trying to make a game that was, I guess, using some of the other types of gaming innovations that people had made in video games, especially in World of Warcraft, and I guess people didn't like the Warcrafty like nature or the video game like nature of fourth edition. This is what I gather. I've never played it. I've never even read a book. But there are people that do like fourth edition, and people who, have a lot of credibility, especially Matt Colville likes fourth edition. And so at some point, I'll probably check it out. I have nothing against fourth edition. It's just that I stopped playing, tabletop games around somewhere in the late 90s, and didn't pick them up again until about 2006 to 7-ish, and didn't get back into D&D until 5th edition in 2014. And then, was really enjoyed getting back into Dungeons and Dragons with my best friends and playing a very, very long campaign that one day I might outline. I took extensive notes on it, and there's a lot of stuff connected to it, a lot of writing about it. But the point is that 2014 was not like a cultural high point for Dungeons and Dragons. It was around one of the low points. So there was a big boom of it when it first came out with the OD&D, and maybe even first edition-ish, but especially OD&D. That was its first little boom. That's when it became a niche game. But then by second edition, it had seen another leg up after a lull, and then the Satanic Panic kind of, put a bullet in it, or I don't know, stabbed the knife in it. It kind of started to dwindle in cultural relevance, and in the 90s, it wasn't seen as, popular, and you weren't popular for playing it. And third edition, I don't think third edition did anything for the cultural relevance of the game, and fourth edition definitely didn't. If third edition increased it a little, fourth edition probably pulled it back a little, I think. But it was the people that had played Dungeons & Dragons in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, a lot of those started to get into to the entertainment industry, and they started to talk about Dungeons and Dragons. And I think one of the first cultural things that I noticed, like, someone in the entertainment industry discussing Dungeons and Dragons, was now I'm forgetting the band's name. So I'm just gonna skip over that part because I can't remember. It was the song was In My Garage, and he's talking about playing Dungeons and Dragons. Anyway, I really like that band, and a lot of my friends who didn't play Dungeons and Dragons actually asked me about that bit of the song. If you remember it, just put in the comments below. I don't know why it's not coming to me. Probably at some point later in the video, it'll like flash back. And anyway, so then there were TV shows that meant Freaks and Geeks had them playing Dungeons and Dragons, and it was pretty accurate. And then, there was cartoons mentioning in it, whether it was Simpsons or Futurama. And then it was by 2015, 2016, Stranger Things came on the air, and this is where Dungeons and Dragons cultural relevance exploded. It had already been increasing by that point, like from 2014 of the release of 5th edition to 2016. There was a lot of YouTube buzz, so a lot of influencers and content creators talking about Dungeons and Dragons, but Stranger Things kind of ramped that up, and then the pandemic came along, and that's where it peaked. So I guess when people are talking about Dungeons and Dragons not doing well, they were all there for the peak. And there's a lot of YouTubers who have talked about their views going down and their channels dying, and they're blaming certain things or this or that, but really it's that people have moved on from Dungeons and Dragons to something else that has got their attention. Whether they've all moved on to the same thing that have got their attention, or whether it's fractured off into other entertainment properties. And it's not necessarily fracturing off into other RPGs. They may have, I'd say most of them have moved out of the RPG space entirely. And what you've got left is the core, the people that are really into RPGs. And some of them, because of some of the things that Wizards of the Coast did with the OGL crisis and things like that, they did move into other indie RPGs or other genres of RPGs or whatever. But the discussions have now fractured into community posts and discords and all this other stuff. And maybe it's a lot of these YouTubers themselves have their own little communities, and they've all kind of collected in these places, whether it's Discord or Reddit or whatever, but people aren't communicating cross community anymore. Some YouTube creators themselves have been less communicative with other YouTubers. Some of them still seem to reference each other, and so they seem to be in contact, but I think there was a lot more cohesion in the YouTube community of D&D content creators. And then, of course, where a lot of people are waiting for, Critical Role's role-playing game. I can't remember what it's called. And then other people are waiting for, I also can't remember what it's called, but Matt Colville's role-playing game. And maybe that'll bring some more discussion to the forefront. But those are still, as far as I know, not even in like a beta testing or anything like that. They're still designing and making those games. And maybe when those games come out, there won't be any increase in, I guess, mentions and Google searches and discussions of role-playing games, because the largest part of the audience has moved on to something else, whatever that is. And I think I've also noticed that board games, tabletop games in general, but especially board games, peaked also just before Dungeons and Dragons peaked. And I think those customers are no longer there, and they're not coming back for, I don't know, years, if ever. And it could just be similar to what I was talking about earlier in the video about me in the late 90s, moving on to other things, mostly going out to nightclubs and restaurants and bars and that kind of stuff because I was 19 to 30, right? So basically it would have been 1995 was when I started, my interest in games started dwindling, and I started going to do different things, whether it was going out to parties or nightclubs or just hanging out with friends, driving around, that sort of stuff. So by 97, 98, there was no game playing whatsoever until, again, in 2006, 2007. So a good 10 years. And that could be where this, big boom in Dungeons and Dragons came from, was 13 to 19-year-olds. And they themselves started going to college, and maybe, nightclubs are dying, so they're not going out to nightclubs, and they might be going out to bars, but they're probably having a lot of house parties. They're probably just hanging out with friends and doing fun stuff, or they're doing something else, reading a lot of books. I don't really know, but I think that there was a glut of Gen Zers who came into it, and Gen Z being either very close to being or very soon to be the largest the largest segment of the population, because the boomers have been slowly dwindling away. Gen X was never a large segment of the population and is probably never going to be a large segment of the population, but we kind of kept these games going for as long as we could. And I think there was a dead zone in the early 2000s. An old video of mine I did mention, and I haven't looked at the sales numbers or anything like that, and it's hard to look at the sales numbers that far back because nowadays, everything is online and you can almost have any information you want at your fingertips, but there wasn't the case before the 2000s that anyone tracked this stuff other than analysts at banks, and they probably were not paying attention to the game industry. So the game industry itself may have tracked this, but now everyone has access to this stuff. Anyway, the point is that I think that the early 2000s were a gaming wasteland, or the late 90s to, say, 95 to 2005. Somewhere in the middle of that was when it was at its lowest point. So the year 2000. And then after that, when Gen Xers started coming back into gaming, and then also millennials started to get excited about gaming, and then Gen Zers in 2015-ish. And we hit the peak somewhere around the pandemic on either side of it, depending on which specific games or industry you're talking about. And now we're in another lull because people have grown up and their interests have shifted, and maybe they're starting careers, that sort of stuff. And we're now in a lull, and these YouTubers have noticed it because their view counts have gone down. And I haven't been doing YouTube that long, so it's not affecting me in any way because I had 0 views, and right now I have anywhere between 0 and 1,000 views on a video, depending on what type of video I make. So it doesn't bother me in the slightest, but it seems to bother them, and I don't think that they all know the reason why. I think they're thinking it's the algorithm going against them, and they don't necessarily understand that the algorithm is just people, what people are interested in. And I think that people are less interested in tabletop games than they were 2, 3, 5 years ago. And that's just the way it is, and I don't think it's coming back anytime soon. I think whatever interest level we have, this is going to be it for now. It's going to be just, several years of lowered interest in comparison to 5 years ago. And so you'll have to plan based on that. And I think that game makers will have to plan based on that. And Dungeons & Dragons has to plan based on that. And so we're in now Dungeons & Dragons 2024, 5.5 edition or 6th edition. And no one's particularly interested in it. And less people are interested in Dungeons & Dragons overall. And so we're in a lull, and there's not many people talking about it, not many people excited about it. there's a small number of people that are excited about role-playing games in general still, but not nearly as much. And that's kind of where we're going to be for quite a while, I think. That's just kind of what I wanted to talk about with Dungeons and Dragons. I wish that I had started doing YouTube in 2016 when everyone was super excited about Dungeons and Dragons, and it was because it'd be a more energizing time, and it's easier to make videos when people are excited and energized about things because you get a lot of feedback, and it inspires you to do more. And that might be why, if you've been watching your favorite YouTuber, you've been watching less and less videos, and you've been noticing there's less content from them, and maybe they've fallen off your algorithm altogether because, there's not as much to talk about as there used to be because there's no hype. We're not in a hype cycle anymore. And a lot of people dislike hype, but, it was fun. It was fun in 2019 to talk about Dungeons and Dragons, and it's less fun now for a lot of people. So if you have a favorite YouTuber that you haven't watched in a while, maybe go back and watch some of their videos, give them some comments and likes, and help them out a little bit. Because, they kind of probably feel a little bit depressed because they're not at the level they were, 5 years ago. And things have become less interesting, and people have become less interested. And while it's steady, and if you're still into role-playing games, it's still great. You can still play them, and you can still find groups more than you ever could in the past of strangers. In the past, like especially in the 80s and 90s, the only way you played a role-playing game is if you personally knew other people that played role-playing games, or you knew people that you could convince to do so, and there weren't that many people you could convince to do so, right? Nowadays, it's a lot easier, even with the inability to find dungeon masters. You can run a game. You can learn to run a game. Matt Colville taught you how to do that. So you can pretty much play a game anytime you want online without having to even go and meet anybody. But you can also go to your local game store and play a game. And you can do it in a library. You can do it at your home, whatever. You can easily meet people online that are nearby you and play Dungeons and Dragons in a way that you couldn't before, even though we're at a low point, in a lull, and things are going to be less exuberant, hyped, exciting than they were before. But I don't know. That's the way I see it. What do you see? What are you seeing in the market? What are you seeing in Dungeons and Dragons? What do you see on the horizon? Do you see things getting better, or do you see it getting worse? Do you see it like I do? It's just kind of going to be like this for a while, and nothing really is going to happen. People are still going to make their videos. People are still going to talk about it, but not in the level of excitement that we did 5-10 years ago. Anyway, let me know. Have a good day.